Shalom friends, today we are taking a look at Israel and some outtakes on things happening in the world around Israel right now. Now we know that Israel is God's chosen people, a nation chosen by God to bless all other nations with. And the prophecies clearly imply and warn us that in the last times things will get testy and heated on this earth around Israel, particularly around Jerusalem or Yerushalayim, as all nations rally up in the end times to wipe it off the landmark. Of course, they will fail in this, and this is what the scriptures clearly tell us about, that things will get heated and testy around Israel in the last days. Now, we had anti-Israel protests worldwide when Israel defended itself against the attacks from the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and basically all nations or nations representative of all the continents took to the streets, protesting against Israel and the alleged brutality that Israel used in defending herself, of course very conveniently ignoring the fact that Israel had been under Hamas attack for the past years, and there was no media coverage on that. But the moment Israel retaliates, and rightly so, we have all these protests, and it's always the same message. This is not confined to just the Arab nations. We have a protest here in London, and these videos are basically just 2 or 3 months old, maybe 4 months old. I downloaded them some weeks ago from the internet. Those are the same messages. I blended out the audio track just to give you an overview of how basically this anti-Israel spirit is not confined to a specific place or concert in the world. This is basically in Europe, this is in the Arab nations, and these are things that seem to pass us by in our daily life and in our daily ways of viewing what happens in the media. Now, it's always the same pictures and always the same gestures, and basically the same spirit, like I said earlier on, not confined to anywhere specifically. This is Indonesia. Massive rallies and massive voices against Israel. Take a look at those pictures. And we need to ask ourselves, where's all this coming from? We never get an explanation, but we do see lots of pictures, agitating, galvanizing people into action, as the list goes on. And is God impressed with all this? No, God is not impressed, because God says in the Psalms that the nations they grumble and create the uproars in vain. The kings are taking positions, conspiring together against Adonai. The cry, let's throw the chains off, and he who sits in heaven, he laughs. God is not impressed. But we need to ask ourselves, what is it about this plot of land that is so interesting? I mean, is there something we don't know? Are we talking about oil depots, resources we don't know of? Are we speaking about gold reserves or diamond reserves? You see, there was no such compounded interest for Palestine prior to 1948, where the British and the French were made to release their mandates for, basically this plot of land. And this was not our centerpiece for worldwide attention back then. And we have to ask ourselves if there's perhaps something spiritual about the enmity to Israel, not just by nations like Lebanon and all the other Islam and Arab nations surrounding Israel, but a hidden and a big enemy of Israel is also the traditional church. And many people will not like to hear this, but you hear of the replacement theory, of the church saying it has replaced Israel, and a system that seems to be spiritual, but in actual fact it is very anti-Israel. And I know what I'm speaking of, because I was many years in such denominations before I came out of them. And this system is basically indoctrinating people and responsible for all those traditions we have today. And we have to ask ourselves, where do they come from? Think about it. If it's not from the Bible, where do these things come from? So looking at some things that are special indeed about Israel, we know that when God delivered Israel out of Egypt, we read in scripture of the wanderings in the desert. Now in the desert we had the tabernacle before the temple was built, and in the tabernacle was where God lived amongst the children of Israel.
in this tabernacle we had the high priest who officiated on behalf of Israel. And the high priest, everything he had on was ordained by God. His breastplate, the incense, the shoulder pieces or the shoulder straps, everything he had on was ordained, clearly instructed by God. God said that these things were to be made according to a pattern, something already existent. So there was a higher model for the priesthood, or a higher model for the priest. This was not meant to, point to a human being. This priest was pointing to the only king priest, who is Yeshua Mashiach. So the high priest of Israel is pointing to Yeshua Mashiach. Looking at a special and certain garment piece of the high priest was the breastplate of judgment. The breastplate of judgment consisted of 12 precious stones, diamond, onyx, stones we've probably never seen. And each precious stone represented a son of Israel, of Jacob. Very precious stones. This is what the breastplate consisted of. But there was something else aside from the breastplate of judgment. We also had the 2 shoulder pieces, one piece or one onyx stone on each shoulder. Each onyx stone was engraved with the sons of Israel, and having 12 names in all, we have 6 names of the sons of Israel on each shoulder piece. Now Yeshua is the king of Israel, and the high priest is pointing to Yeshua. We'll take a look at the tabernacle once again. We remember that we said, and scripture also informs us of this, that God lived in the tabernacle amongst the children of Israel, with Israel representing God's chosen people. Now the encampment of Israel around the tabernacle was not done in a disorderly fashion. Each cardinal point, northwest, east, and south, was each occupied by 3 tribes of Israel. Now Palestine, as we have it today, was allotted to Israel by God through Joshua, and also named after the 12 tribes of Israel. So when we know that Yeshua is Israel's king, where is Yeshua coming back to? Is he coming back to New York? Is Yeshua coming back to Berlin? Is Yeshua perhaps coming back to London? No. Yeshua is coming back to Israel. He will land on the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives, my friends, is in Israel. So where's all the hate against Israel coming from? The hate is not just against Israel as a nation. The hate is against the evidence of God's existence. The world and the traditional church who go after Satan do not want to acknowledge the God of Israel. This is why the hate against Israel is so prevalent today. Let's take a look at the New Jerusalem. Something interesting. Some interesting things. This is a sketch of the New Jerusalem. This is not the New Jerusalem. And we read that the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven from God. It had 12 gates and a high wall. Inscribed on the gates were the 12 names of the tribes of Israel. 3 gates to the east, to the north, south, and west. And we remember something interesting in the way Israel camped around the tabernacle. 3 to the north, to the east, and to the south, and then to the west, just as we read in the New Jerusalem. And the city is laid out on a square, something else we have to take note of. Its length equal to its width. Now let's take a look at something interesting from the breastplate of judgment, as we saw earlier on. The breastplate is also a square with 12 names of Israel on its plate. So the breastplate, the tabernacle, the high priest who embodies Israel, who is Yeshua, the gate of the New Jerusalem being Israel, everything points to Israel. So inheriting with God only occurs in Israel. This is the crux of the spiritual battle going on right now. So do not be misled, my friend, by this new modern religion of Christianity or Christendom which claims to have replaced Israel. This is not the case. The Apostle Paul, he warns the Romans, as he warns us as well. This applies to us, that we are not to boast against Israel. We do not replace Israel as Gentiles. We are grafted into Israel. We are not the new chosen people of God, my brothers and sisters. Elohim says through the prophet, and when we stand at the crossroads and ask for direction, we are not to look for new ways, but to ask for the ancient path, which is the good way, so that we find rest in our souls and live. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.